don't you? It is so nice to be here. It's so nice to visit with the young people that are getting ready to take over things, and that's what I'm going to talk about. What you're getting ready to take over, what we ought to do about it to improve things, and there's a lot we can do. It's a mess, you know it, but there's a lot we can do, and there's no reason for us not to be able to do it. You know, one thing that we have to understand when we try to improve our own government is we have to understand the tools of government. And probably the most powerful tool of government is using fear. They want to scare the people. If they scare the people enough, the government can do almost anything it wants. But you know, the understanding of the founders was that the people, you know, the government should fear the people should never fear the government. Today, unfortunately, more so every day, the people are beginning to fear the government, and that's wrong. We have to reverse that. But in recent history, I can think of some episodes where people have become very fearful, and government takes advantage of it. Sometimes it's a legitimate reason. Usually they play on the legitimate fear, but then they use it as an excuse to do something that they shouldn't be doing. Take, for instance, the 9/11, one of the biggest tragedies that we've had to face, an attack on our country, and a lot of people being killed, and figuring out who did what and why and what we should do about it. But because there was a lot of fear and people were worried, they had a piece of legislation floating around for quite a few years. They didn't have a name on that legislation, but it was to control the people more, to make sure that the government could come into our houses easier without search warrant, to intimidate people, to embolden the government. So after 9/11, they saw this as an opportunity that it looks like they could pass this act. So surely, within a short period of time, within a week or two, that bill came to the floor of the House. It was very, very long and very complicated, and we had about an hour or so to study it, and it passed overwhelmingly. And so I knew some of the bad stuff in it, even though a lot of people, we really didn't have a chance to read it, but it had been floating around. So I was sitting next to a member of Congress, and he was getting ready and he voted for it. I said, why are you voting for this? You haven't even read it. You don't know what's in it. I told him a few things. He said, it doesn't matter. He said, it doesn't matter. He says, it's called the Patriot Act. How can you vote against the Patriot Act? And I said, well, maybe, he says, if I vote against the Patriot Act and have to go home, how would I explain it to the people in my district? I said, well, that's your job. You're supposed to go home and explain it to your people why you voted for the Patriot Act, which is unpatriotic to have supported that. But they used this as an example of passing legislation that they wanted passed anyway, because there's been an encroachment on our personal liberties and our personal privacies over the many years. It's been involved with the IRS and the drug war and the various things and privacy virtually doesn't exist and is getting worse constantly. But then there is, not too long after that, they built up fear because as a consequence of what was happening on 9/11, it was legitimate, and I supported going after those individuals, the Al-Qaeda, that committed this crime, and they had a pretty good opportunity very early on to get bin Laden at Tora Bora in Afghanistan, and they sort of blew it and let it go and forgot about it for about 10 years. But when they ignored going after the very person, the individuals, the group that caused 9/11, what they did was they diverted their attention. They said, the real threat is Iraq. We have to go to war against Iraq. And they had to build up and scare the people into accepting this war. So they said the Al-Qaeda's in Iraq, they have weapons of mass destruction, and they participated in 9/11, and if we don't stop them, they're going to attack us with a nuclear weapon. And they beat the war drums for weeks and months, and finally, we went to war against Iraq while forgetting about the people that actually committed the crimes against us. But when we get in there, what did they have? No weapons of mass destruction, no Al-Qaeda, and there was really no threat. Now, my answer to that would have been that if you look at the analysis and you think there was a threat, you take the evidence to the Congress. If you think you have to have a war, you shouldn't do it unless the Congress declare it. The declare the war, and then you go in and fight it. But the tragedy there was no threat. We shouldn't have been in there, and we're still in that area. It's the time to reassess our foreign policy and talk about coming out of that region entirely. Recently, they used the fear tactic just a few years ago in 2008, and that has to do with economics. Scare the people. Oh, you know, the world is coming to an end. You're going to have a depression that's going to last for 30 years because the financial bubble has burst, and we have to bail out the country and the world. So what did they do? They started passing TARP funds, and they got the Federal Reserve to create $15 trillion worth of credit. But guess what? They bailed out the people that caused all the trouble. They bailed out the people who had been benefited, the people who should have gone bankrupt. They scared the Congress and the people into saying that, you know, if you don't do that, there will be a depression. There will be a depression. And in a way, they were right about there. There would have been a depression for the very people who deserved the depression. You know, the ones who were ripping us off and the ones who got bailed out. But what did they do? They scared the people and the Congress into bailing out the people who were doing the benefits. And guess what? The middle class lost. Taxes became higher. We have more inflation. Jobs were lost. We went into a recession. And houses, you know, people lost their houses. But they weren't able to do that unless they scared the people. So we have to be very careful to be aware of what the governments so often have done over the years. But we need a government that will be straightforward with the people and tell the people the truth and not use these tactics to either do irrational things economically or do irrational things in the foreign policy area. That's the very least we deserve. We deserve truth from our government. In economics, it's not unusual the government fibs to us, if not lie to us about economic statistics. They tell us, well, there is no inflation, and the inflation is there, it's only 2%, 3%, so therefore Social Security beneficiaries do not qualify for cost of living increases. Where if you use the calculations on the cost of living increases and the CPI the way it used to be calculated, it's like 8 or 9%. But the government keeps pretending there's no inflation. American people say, well, it can't be true. My prices are going up all the time. What if you measure the cost of your education, whether there's any inflation? Compare your education to the cost of my education a while back, much, much higher than inflation. It was in hundreds of dollars today. I understand your tuition is in thousands of dollars per semester. That's inflation, and it's much higher, but the government continues to deceive us. Talk about unemployment rate. We're supposed to be ecstatic. They said last week unemployment rate's down to 8.6%, under 9%, and we're supposed to get excited. But if you use the old-fashioned way of calculating how unemployment occurs, the kind of people unemployed, looking for work, if you look at people very underemployed, maybe working a couple days a week and just barely making it, and if you look at the people who have dropped out of the workforce, you know what the unemployment rate is? 22%. That's why the people feel a lot worse than the government tells us we're supposed to feel. So this is the reason you have to have honest answers with our problems, what we have to do, because if you don't admit the truth, you know, it's pretty hard to take the medicine that we have to take and the policies that we have to change. But fortunately for all of us, if we recognize our problems and we have to make some changes, I'm quite convinced that you don't have to sacrifice anything. Most people say, well, you know, we got to fix this, so everybody has to sacrifice. But if you take away the bailouts and the TARP funds and the Federal Reserve bailing out their friends, how does that be a sacrifice on you? That would be a blessing to you. You won't have to pay for it. And,
yep.
Of course, in a free market economy, you know, guess what? A true free market economy, you don't have an income tax. Now, that's not much of a sacrifice, is it? But you say, well, how will the government pay for all this? Well, prices wouldn't be up as much. There would be more prosperity. Jobs would be more available. And people could take care of themselves. But if prices are soaring, It's much harder for you to work your way through college today than it was when I went to school. Because in comparison, I paid a total of $325 a semester for my 18 hours I was taking. And I could have 2 or 3 part-time jobs and earn my education, and earn the funds for my education. But that's not available. The jobs aren't available, and the tax system is bad, and the prices go up. Inflation is so unfair. Some people think that inflation is a solution, that it's a benefit. You borrow money, you pay it back with cheap money. But inflation is very, very damaging. And they pretend it doesn't exist, but inflation hurts some people a lot more than others. If you're on a fixed income, it hurts you a lot more. If you're on the receiving end of certain funds, on Wall Street and the bailouts, that's a benefit. But one characteristic of the destruction of a currency, as Austrian economics teaches, is that when you destroy a currency, devalue the currency, make it worth less by printing too much of it, it damages the middle class the most. It wipes out the middle class, and wealth gravitates from middle class to the wealthy. All you have to do is look around today. Wall Street's doing quite well. The banks can borrow money at 1% and loan it out again to the government at 3%, and they make enough money. And they won't loan it out because of the circumstances to businesses that are trying to get started. So even though there's a lot of credit out there, there's certain people that won't just let this credit go. And this is a consequence of policies that should be changed, that can be changed, because we've given up and we've allowed the people to regulate the market and take over rather than letting the market operate. The free market can provide the jobs. Governments can't provide jobs. That's not the responsibility of the government. In a free society, the responsibility of government is to protect your freedom. And a few other things. Provide a strong national defense, to protect property rights, protect contract rights, not by giving us a sound currency. How about a prohibition against counterfeiting? You and I can't counterfeit. Why in the world do we allow the Federal Reserve to counterfeit? So the solution is not complex. It's rather understanding liberty as Thomas Jefferson understood it. He understood where it came from and the responsibility of the government. And our liberties don't come from our government. It comes from our Creator, or it comes to us in a natural manner and belongs to us. So if our life and our liberty is a consequence of a natural course of events or a gift from our Creator, it fits to say, it follows through to say that if it's your life and your liberty, and you're ambitious and you work, the fruits of your labor ought to belong to you. You should have There's an old-fashioned idea called the incentive system, which we've essentially undermined. Today, the incentives, and where all the money goes to try to redistribute wealth, is not the creation of new wealth. It's all put into paying for the lobbyists and paying for the politicians to go up and grab hold of a small piece of a pie that is shrinking. And that's why we have to change something. The pie has to be growing, and it has to be in the marketplace, and it has to be a reward for your effort. But because this is ending, the system that we have experimented, especially in the last 40 years since we destroyed totally and completely the restraints on the Federal Reserve and on our monetary system and no longer have a gold standard. This last 40 years has been an experiment in a policy of economics called Keynesian economics, interventionism, planned economy, welfareism, inflationism. The results are in. It doesn't work. It's not worth the effort. If you don't change it, it's going to get a lot worse. We want to opt out for free markets and sound money and property rights. Somewhere along the way, 100 years ago or so, that is when about the time we had an income tax introduced to the Federal Reserve, changed our foreign policy, but something else happened. Somehow or another, our country took freedom and people defend one part of it and other people defend another. Sometimes it's a political party, one versus the other. But they don't defend liberty as a whole. Liberty means your right to your life and the right to your property. But some people think, well, the government is responsible to protect your right in free enterprise and have less regulations and less taxes. But somebody else might say, well, freedom means that they ought to stay out of my life. It's my life. I can do with my own body, mind, and soul what I want as long as I don't hurt other people. And other peoples defend that. Well, why can't we defend this as a whole? It's your life and your liberty. It should be your personal life as well as your economic life. Under those circumstances, it's a wonderful experiment because it will create the greatest prosperity. But the other part that I love about it is the freedom philosophy and the Constitution. It's not divisive. It brings people together. If you really understand liberty, you're not so judgmental about telling other people what to do with their lives and tell them how to instruct them or how to spend their money. And the Constitution defends that. So this brings diversity together, and if people want to use their life in a positive way, or if they want to waste their life, it's up to them. You can be responsible for your own life, your family, your friends, and your neighbors, and you can persuade people and through your church. But when the government assumes this responsibility that it's going to moralize with you and tell you what to do with your life, and moralize with you on how they're going to take your money and take it and give it to somebody else who might not be so ambitious, it ruins the whole thing. Liberty. There's a lot of people in Washington, they call it American exceptionalism. Sounds like a wonderful thing. I think we have been an exceptional nation. But what they say American exceptionalism is that we have this moral obligation to tell other people in other countries what to do because they have imperfect governments. Well, that is true. But let me tell you, before we tell other countries what to do with their imperfect government, we ought to deal with our imperfect government. Care. So it should be your choice. People can't defraud you and lie to you and pretend they have cures that they don't have. So there is a regulation, but today the regulations are controlled by the drug companies. So every time you hear anything going on in Washington, how they're going to give you better medical care, it's going to be free and everybody's going to have it, you wonder, well, who are the lobbyists? Or whether it's Republican prescription drug programs or Obamacare that's going on, guess what? The lobbyists line up. It's the corporations, it's the drug companies. companies, it's the insurance companies, it's health management companies, it's the medical associations that are lining up, you know, to get a piece of the pie and a piece of the action. So this is, it doesn't solve the problem, and along with inflation, it pushes the prices up and takes away the competition. But on the foreign policy issue, I believe you can apply these same rules to foreign policy. I like to think about foreign policy ought to follow a golden rule. We know about the golden rule. You don't treat your neighbor, your friends as you would like to be treated. That's not too complicated. All the major religions have virtually endorsed the principle of the golden rule. But it seems like that's the last thing we ever think about in our country, of the golden rule about treating other countries the way we would like to be treated. What would we think if people were dropping drone missiles on us and killing people in this country, having collateral damage and killing innocent people? I think we'd be pretty darn annoyed with it. No wonder they're annoyed with us and what we do all over the Middle East and around the world. So I think it's time we said, look, why don't we take the advice of the Founding Fathers? They said, yes, you should be isolationist, you should be engaged in the world, you should be friends and trade with anybody willing to do it. You ought to use diplomacy at times when you can. Just think, we have 12,000 diplomats. Don't you think it'd be a pretty good idea if we started using them once in a while? The Soviets were practically at their peak. They had 30,000 nuclear weapons and missiles that could be delivered here, and they parked them down there in Cuba. And they're on the verge, we are on the verge of having a nuclear confrontation. But at that time, Kennedy had at least the wisdom to call Khrushchev before the war got going. And Khrushchev just said to him, he said, look, you have missiles in Turkey pointing at us, and that's on our borders. And Kennedy says, oh yeah, I understand that. So he said, what can we do? Well, you take them out of Turkey, we'll take them out of Cuba. Thank goodness for that. You know, I mean, we didn't know this was the Soviet system collapsed for predictable reasons. They had an economic system that was deeply flawed, and they had this silly notion that they could expand their empire and go in and occupy Afghanistan. Can you imagine how silly that notion was? So here we are, we're bankrupt, no money at all, so a lot of inflation, a weak economy, no production. So what are we doing? We're looking for another war. We're in Iraq, we're in Pakistan, we're in Afghanistan, we're in Libya now. We're very much involved in Egypt, passing on money that we don't have. We've already started and moving towards Syria, and there is already a confrontation with the people of Iran, which makes no sense whatsoever. Once again, the fear is being built up. They're telling you that the Iranians are about to attack us with a nuclear weapon. About to attack us with a nuclear weapon that they don't have. In our CIA, the United Nations, they don't even claim that they have it. And they're getting everybody ready and geared up to go into another war. Make them explain it to you. And if I am your president, I will explain it to you, and I'll tell you there's probably no need to start another war. and look at the problems that we've had. This idea that we're about to end in Iraq, it's not true. You know, they said there are 8,000 Army people are going to be taken out of active forces. Well, they're adding 17,000 contractors to the embassy in Baghdad. You know, we're really leaving it, yet we have an embassy that's almost as big as the Vatican, the biggest in the world. And they're going to spend about $1 billion, and we're going to put 17,000 Americans in this country that we say that we're not going to be involved in, just building up fear and distortion. And this whole thing that Iran might attack us with a weapon they don't have. They have all this oil, and they're selling it, and they're holding in there against all the sanctions we put on them. At the same time, they have to import gasoline. They don't even make enough gasoline. They can't even refine gasoline enough for themselves. And here we're supposed to be intimidated and fearful and be able to go blindly into war. This is where I say we shouldn't be so intimidated and so weak as to say that we're not allowed to talk to people. I think sometimes talking requires more strength than just being intimidated and dropping bombs on people. One of the reasons why I've talked about monetary policy so long has been that the threat to liberty is big government. If you have big government to fight endless wars overseas, or big government to run a welfare system, that always fails. It undermines the people, it undermines productions, it undermines your liberties, just as we see is happening today, you know, with the Patriot Act and other things. This whole idea of what that they just passed in the Senate and they're getting ready to pass in the House. This whole idea that the war on terrorism is against all of us, that the battleground is America, that military law can be imposed, American citizens can be captured and put in prison, including Guantanamo, and denied a lawyer. That's what's on the books. And it looks like it's going to pass. So we are not getting more free. We are getting less free. Now, the way the Federal Reserve works into this is when government grows, you have to stop the growth of government. It'd be good if we just had enough people there to quit spending the money. Or a president who would veto every single bill, that might help too. If our government couldn't borrow money, couldn't print money, and they had to pay for everything they do by direct taxation, government would grow. Everybody would know exactly how big the government is. Also, something that would help about, to get the people's attention is repeal withholding. Just if you can't get rid of the taxes, repeal withholding. What if every American knew exactly how much tax they paid every week? They'd write a check to the government. All of a sudden, this thing would end rather quickly, and people would be outraged on how much taxes they pay. But because we facilitated, Jefferson argued that the government should be able to borrow money, but that didn't pass, and our government is permitted under the Constitution to borrow money. But they did not give the authority to do the next step. If you can't tax enough, if you can't borrow enough, well, create a Federal Reserve System that just prints the money. And that is what happens. So because they can do that, and you don't see the consequence right away, and it's delayed, and you can't find exactly who suffers the most, like some people benefit and some people suffer, what it does, it causes government to grow, and the bigger the government grows, the worse our liberties are, the worse our economy is. So we have to address foreign policy, monetary policy, domestic economic policy, tax policy, regulatory policy, if we want to restore a prosperous free society. And that should be our goal. If we just provide the right environment, the burden does not fall on the president or the Congress to decide what you want to do with your life, what you want to do with your money, or what foreigners want to do with their government. It would be something that would come about differently, but you had to provide the right environment. And that was the genius of the founders. They provided the right environment. They knew and understood what sound money meant. They knew and understood what free markets meant, what property rights meant, what contracts meant, and the rest was left up to the people. So tragically, I believe, is what's happened over this last 100 years. Is we've lost our understanding and our confidence how a free society works. And that is going to be the burden placed on your shoulders to find out and understand exactly how freedom works, why it's a benefit, where the shortcomings are and to expect them and how you compensate for them, but not to throw up your hands and say, well, what's the government going to do? How's the government going to take care of me? Well, we know what they did when they decided everybody wanted a house. Yeah, they had a housing program and they printed a lot of money. And guess what? A few people went bankrupt. They got bailed out. The middle class lost their jobs and they lost their houses. It doesn't work. So when the government gets involved, it's pretty risky business. And then when it gets touch and go, then they want to build up more fear to scare us into immediately saying, well, we need the government to take care of us. One of the most upsetting statements that I heard right after 9/11 was, yes, I know you're not supposed to sacrifice your liberties, for security, but under these conditions, we must do this in order to be safe. I have a different opinion. I don't think you ever have to sacrifice any liberty for your security. It's not necessary to do that. Circumstances that led up to 9/11, it was our lack of confidence in personal property rights and responsibilities, because the government was still, at that time, even before 9/11, was in charge of providing security. They had the checkpoints and they had instructions, never oppose a hijacker, and you weren't allowed to have guns. The airlines weren't in charge; they didn't have guns in the plane, and it was just a setting. So if the individual, if the company, the airlines or a private company, like here where I live, it's the chemical companies. They know how to provide security. They have fences and guns and private police, and they're very secure areas. But what did we do when the government failed in their assumption that they would make a statement on airlines? It made it worse. It turned it all over. They created the TSA. We don't need a TSA to be safe. Let me tell you. What we need is more confidence in ourselves and more confidence in how freedom works. Understanding that it's interesting that freedom's only been tried a short period of time. You look at 10,000 years of history, there hasn't been all that much freedom. Most of recorded history, you have dictators and kings and pharaohs, ruling. And even if you look at the world today, even those special governments that we prop up, like Saudi Arabia and other places, we prop up so many dictators. We gave $40 billion to Mubarak, and all the money that we have spent to prop up dictatorship. So it's been only a small test. We've had the best test in this country. We've had the freest system and the most prosperous system, and yet we're letting it slip by. And you're getting this, but it really isn't that difficult. If we just did one thing to look at the problems that we have, see where the problems came from, if we did just one thing, we could solve most of these problems, and that is only send people to Washington, D.C., who will uphold their oath of office and obey the Constitution. The good news is you have a lot of friends out there. It seems like we have a lot of friends in this room. People thinking this way. They're thinking this way because the evidence is apparent now. No longer can they frighten us and say that you're afraid, we want you to accept more government. Right now we're saying we've had too much government. The government is inept. They don't solve the problems. They try to do the things that they're not supposed to be doing, and they don't do the things they're supposed to do. They're supposed to protect our monetary system and private property, but no, they do these other things. So we know where the problem is. We know what to do, but now what we need are some changes in Washington. We need changes in the next election. We need more help in the Congress. We do need a new president. In case you haven't noticed. Thing is that we need people like you to support a new president and a new Congress for these views. The government that we have is a reflection of the people. Up until now, so far, until these last couple of years, the absolute prevailing attitude of the people was, the government will take care of me, they'll provide my safety and my security, they'll give me a free education stamps and unemployment benefits forever. Yeah, you know what? It doesn't work. What you better fight for and argue for and work for is fighting for your liberty and looking toward the greatness of this country in the past, and there's no reason in the world why we can't restore that. It will take a little bit of time, but we've already tried 4 years, and we're not getting anywhere. The Depression took 17 years. Japan's into it for 20 years. At the rate we're going to be 20 more years. But if you switch the gears and say that we're changing things, we're bringing our troops on, we're balancing the budget, we're cutting the spending and all these things, it might take a year or so to just get the government out of the way. So I have a proposal. My proposal is a budgetary proposal because I call spending a tax. So my tax policy is for spending. Because if the government spends money, they're either going to tax you directly, they borrow it, and then they pay for it later, or print money, which is an inflation tax. So my proposal is not complicated. The first year, I want to cut. I want to cut spending, real spending, not this pretense of cutting proposed increases. I'm not talking about real spending cuts. So my modest approach to this is to cut $1 trillion the first year. This, and you can cut half of it from the overseas spending and have a stronger national defense, not a weaker national defense. So you don't have to be worried about people saying, oh, you don't want to have a national defense. We're better off, let me tell you. You cut the other half here at home by going back, to an ancient date of like 2006, when government was still way too bad, and if you had a 2006 budget, along with cutting this overseas spending, you could cut $1 trillion in 1 year. And that would send a powerful message, just our troops coming home. Just think of bringing these thousands and thousands of troops home, let them spend their money here instead of in Japan and Germany, instead of stimulating their economy. Let them stimulate our economy for a while. Along with these reforms to really release the creative energy that Americans have and will have, and that is the taxes should be cut. The ideal tax is zero income tax, no inheritance tax. Don't tax the corporations that want to bring their money back home. Don't chase the corporations overseas by over-taxation and over-regulation. Quit giving the money to the corporations that are living off us. That's what we have to do, not tax the people who want to do but it's a political problem in getting the people to agree to this. But this is where, I tell you, I'm optimistic. I go to a lot of campuses, we get good crowds out, get enthusiasm, and it seems to me that the young people, the college people inheriting this mess, you don't seem to be frightened by the concept of liberty and the concept of accepting responsibility. And that is wonderful, I think. And this is the reason I am an optimist on the long run if we do the right things. If we don't, I have a new assessment. We better be prepared because it's going to get a lot worse. But it doesn't have to be. And from the messages I'm getting back from the people who have supported the campaign, it's very, very positive. And from what I sense, I think we're going to do very well, not only across the country, but very well in this state on January 3rd.